Despicable Me is an animated franchise. That's about as much as I can say about it, because it doesn't need an introduction, as it is one of, if not the most profitable animated franchises of all time, and most definitely the flagship of Illumination's catalog. So out of a need to catch up on current trends, like saying the obligatory, with the release of the new Minions Rise of Gru movie line, I've decided to rewatch the entirety of Despicable Me, including Minions, because let's be honest, talking about Despicable Me without the Minions is like talking about Star vs. the Forces of Evil without mentioning the finale, i.e. me. And I feel this video should be good enough practice for me to make more of these retrospective type reviews in preparation for what I'm about to do with Warner Bros. Animated films. Oh, and Star vs. too, I suppose. I'm also gonna try my best to review the movies without bringing up their reputation and reception over the years, further sharing my own, unbiased, personal thoughts on each film without relying on others' opinions as to avoid sounding like a broken record. Now, without further ado, quoting my boy Doofenshmirtz, if I had a nickel for every time I mentioned Star vs. in a Despicable Me video, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Wait, what the fuck am I on? Let's get this shit started. Gonna say this right off the bat. This is a basic movie. The movie story-wise is nothing special. It's a simple family movie about a bad guy trying to be the #1 bad guy until he adopts 3 orphan girls who he at first views as an objective and nothing else, until he gets attached to them and bonds with them to a point where he accepts them, while at the same time dealing with a rival villain. It's a very safe, predictable, by-the-numbers story, yet it makes for a really good movie. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I was a bit anxious that I wouldn't like it as much as I did when I was like, 11 years old? But rewatching it in 2022, it luckily still remains as a good film, just not as great as I remember it. I think my enjoyment of the film boils down to how charming it is with the simplicity. In general, I'm in the belief that a predictable movie can work, as long as I have a reason to invest in what's happening or if I like the characters. Otherwise, if a movie is so bland and generic, to a point where I don't care about anything that happens in the story or any of the central characters, then yeah, it's guaranteed to be shit.
Man, shut your bitch ass up!
Despicable Me, I think, is one of the best examples of how a simple story can be made into something both fun and relatively easy to get into. The characters are what especially hook me into the story, mainly with Gru and the girls. Gru by far has the most interesting character arc. Him adopting the girls and his bond with them gives him that feeling that he's never had growing up. Love and appreciation. And as the film goes on, you start to sympathize with him knowing that no one ever gave him those feelings, not even his mother initially, which makes the moment in the end where she for once shows appreciation for him earned. I also found the girls to be likable as well. They are mostly one note, but they do a decent job at making you care for them as much as you'd care for Gru. Not just for them being orphaned and being treated like shit, but because in spite of some of their slightly smart-alecky interactions with Gru, they still mean well and have their own quirks that make their characters feel authentically like how a real child would act, if that makes sense. Not to mention being complimented with some fantastic vocal performances from Steve Carell, Miranda Cosgrove, Jason Segel, etc. The biggest highlight is for sure the heart of the film, particularly with, again, Gru and the girls. Their dynamic feels natural, and the movie spends a good amount of time focusing on the bond between them, so as a result, it gives the viewers time to know them. Both scenes where Gru reads a bedtime story is a good example. The former highlights how attached Gru has become to the orphans, further leading him to reconsider his heist mission, and the latter scene in the end, while not the most subtle with the theme and message, is still pretty clever payoff. And as said before, it wouldn't be a Despicable Me video without mentioning the most crucial aspect. Vector. He is such an entertaining antagonist that every time he's on screen I can't help but to give an uncomfortably wide smile at how fucking priceless his lines are.
Both direction and magnitude! Oh yeah!
Anyway, let's talk about the Minions. What surprised me looking back was how sparingly they appear in the movie, despite being an obvious driving force for the marketing, and when they do make appearances, it doesn't feel too distracting from what's important in the story, and are genuinely kinda funny in small doses. Gee, I sure hope the future movies won't completely fuck this one up. Now that I think about it, however, I think the best slapstick to come out of the Minions to me was when they're in pain. I might sound sadistic,
but I just cherish seeing them suffer.
Speaking of which, I think some of the humor that isn't just Minion slapstick can be quite funny at times, mostly when Vector is on screen like I stated before. I'll admit that while the animation is pretty good for Illumination's first film, I was never a fan of the art style. Some of the designs look kinda awkward in places, and it does look dated compared to what they were capable of in the next 10 years, which is to say making their movies look as overly detailed and fancy looking as possible, but we'll get to that in a bit. Plus, there's some parts that don't make much sense to me, like the logistics of the shrink ray relying on the mass of an object for it to grow back. It's not exactly explained why it has a limit, and considering that it's supposedly technologically advanced to be tested in a laboratory, it's surprising that there's no authorities going after them after stealing it. And the main goal of Gru is to steal the moon, which in of itself makes no sense unless the plan outside of being the best would be to end humanity, but that isn't the point. Because of how costly it would be to pull off such a feat, after the bank no longer funds him, he realizes thanks to being given money that they could just make their own rocket. Why he hasn't conveniently thought of this before, knowing they have enough parts to build a makeshift rocket, I have no clue. But overall, those might just be nitpicks, as I still think this is a solid watch in my book. Nothing amazing, but the simplicity of the plot and characters, along with some good comedy, make it a fun and charming hour and a half. And as expected from a fun and charming hour and a half long movie with marketable sidekicks, it made a fuck ton of money.
No skip, Sherlock.
Of course, we all know what this means. A sequel.
Seems like nobody gives a fuck about this party except you. She's a hater! Get this bitch!
I'm gonna say this right off the bat. This is a basic movie. The movie story-wise is honestly nothing special. It's a simple romance movie about a guy trying to be the #1 guy until he meets a woman whom he at first gets annoyed by, until he gets attached and bonds with her to a point where he accepts her, while at the same time dealing with a rival villain. It's a very safe, predictable by-the-number story, and I have just copy-pasted my opening paragraph of the first section. What? I'm very creative today, fuck you. Despicable Me 2 was another film I liked as a tasteless child, but rewatching it for the first time in 5 years made me realize something. This is the first one again, except it's almost the complete opposite of what I liked about it. Remember how I kept saying the simplicity of the first film was what worked about it? Despicable Me 2 goes with such a generic romance storyline that it just makes the movie a slog to get through. Not to mention feeling like a rehash of the original. Gru goes through nearly the exact same character arc that he did in the first film as well, but this time he becomes lovesick. I.e. Marco in season 4 from what I hear. For fuck's sake, why do I keep bringing that up? Free nickels. Free nickels. Still not a lot. It's like Illumination took the formula of the original and made it significantly more tiresome. It opens with a heist occurring in another location. There's a reverse subversion where Gru looks like he's about to pack some heat, but then he's just pumping balloons. Minion filler. He meets up with a partner whom he's mildly annoyed by. Minion filler. They bond after only a few minutes worth of chemistry, followed up with a breakup moment. Minion filler, which leads to the climax where the love interest gets captured by the villain and he has to save her. Oh, and it ends with a dance party ending too, because, you know, dance party endings. Oh, and Minion filler, because fucking why not?
Stop sending me pictures of minions over Facebook, okay? Stop it!
Stop posting about Among Us!
You might think me predicting everything that happens in the movie was a result of me having already seen the film beforehand, but even if I were to pretend I haven't seen it yet, I still predicted just about everything going on in the film. Outside of a few tweaks, it feels like an unnecessary retelling, with the main difference being that it has 10 times the amount of filler the first film had, and now it's no longer funny. I chuckled like 2 or 3 times throughout the whole thing, but that was about it. I don't know, I felt the first as a standalone film wrapped things up pretty nicely, completing Gru's character now having a family. On paper, a sequel where he tries to find a wife could have been endearing, but it's executed in the most cookie-cutter fashion, and it results in Gru not really changing much as a character. Plus, we don't get nearly as much screen time with both him and Lucy as we did in the first film with the girls. All we get is him meeting up with her, getting mildly annoyed, and then after like one failed date night, they start bonding and he becomes uncharacteristically happy. It sucks because they could have actually worked as a romantic spy duo, which is something I never thought I'd say. There are some cute interactions between them, but those are few and far between. The love interest's only real trait is that, well, she's quirky and energetic, but she doesn't have much of an arc outside of realizing she likes Gru, which would have been earned if they had actual chemistry. Otherwise, the payoff feels really rushed, and it has slightly a longer runtime, so what went wrong? wait. Oh, I remember now. It's cause not only do we get even more minion filler than before, but we also have an entire side story dedicated to them, yay. Which also contributes to the main plot somehow. So apparently there's a twist, where as it turns out, Dr. Nefario works for this Mexican superhero guy who's thick AF, who also traps the minions in an island in order to use this purple substance. No, it's not lean. To turn them into an evil army, so they become indestructible and take over the world and shit. Though admittingly it does transition to a pretty entertaining scene where Gru and the family use the plot convenience antidote to shoot up the purple crackheads into their normal selves. Too bad the rest of this movie isn't as entertaining. I know this might seem like a giant comparison at this point, but the more I think about it, and especially on rewatch, I felt that me liking this film as a kid was just me actually liking the original in reality, because outside of some decently improved animation and some notable differences, the film feels almost the same as the original formula-wise. Don't get me wrong, I wanted to like this one going in, but even when it doesn't try to dangle member berries in front of me about Despicable Me, it's just so predictable and uneventful for the majority of its run. And as you can imagine, it's the kind of sequel that was made purely because the original made a fuck ton of money. Wow, color me shocked.
Number 7. Student watches porn and gets naked.
So naturally, this one also made a fuck ton of money, further spawning the next movie that made an even bigger fuck ton of money. Great, now I'm really starting to sound like a broken record. Seriously, writing these reviews is harder than I thought. What the hell?
Kill yourself. The fuck? Please kill yourself.
Ever thought there wasn't enough screen time for these guys than there already was? Well, how about a Minions spin-off prequel?
I command that you shoot me now.
The movie is set up as the origin story of how the Tic Tacs were conceived, on top of how they function as a society where they need to look for a boss. They meet up with Sandra Bullock, and wacky hijinks ensue. Firstly, I'm not even gonna bring up the obvious retcon of how they were genetically produced rather than being born with. What am I, a nerd? Only nerds would bring up that crap. But what I will bring up is these three: Kevin, Bob Dylan, and Stuart Little. These names don't mean shit to you until you see the prior movies.
Looking good, Kevin!
I guess this guy was Kevin, but this guy is also Kevin. It doesn't even end there. They screw up not one, but all of the three main minions' names.
Tim, Bob, Phil!
So I think Kevin here is actually supposed to be Bob, but Bob is the one-eyed one too for some reason, even though it should be Stuart. I'd say these are retcons, but more often than not, I feel like they just picked names out of a hat. Who is the real Bob? Who is the real Stuart? And who is the real Kevin? Shit, I am way too knowledgeable on Minion lore now. What the hell? Have I become the MatPat of Despicable Me canon? Enlighten me in the comments, I genuinely want to know. But lore breaking aside, this is not a good movie. As a prequel explaining the origins of the Minions, we really didn't learn anything about them outside of the surface level personalities they have. Not that it would matter, since the Minions without Gru couldn't carry their own B story, let alone a 90-minute film. I would say it's because of how they don't speak full English, so they wouldn't be able to carry their own story. But then again, I'd argue that it is possible to make a movie about characters who don't speak. Case in point, the underrated Shaun the Sheep movie. But you said you weren't going to be biased.
Shut the fuck up!
The story is much more simplistic than Minions, but what made it work was how it was told. It was quick, to the point, you knew what the characters were about and what their goal was, and all without a single word spoken, just gibberish. Whereas this film barely has much of a story to speak of. It's just a disjointed collection of shorts where the Minions do random shit. I get that's exactly what anyone would expect to see, but for a movie that should be simple and to the point of what its goal was as established in the first 10 minutes, it juggles multiple ideas that come right the hell out of nowhere. Like, it goes from them finding the boss to Bob becoming the king of England to Kevin turning into a kaiju monster or some shit.
We're dicks! We're reckless, arrogant, stupid dicks! And the Film Actors Guild are pussies.
Sandra Overkill, what's her name, might just be the worst villain in the franchise by far. She's so inconsistent. Like, her motive is that she wants to be queen because she's tired of pretending she's not, I guess. So she has the minions steal the queen's crown, and they technically do, but then she's like, you little shits betrayed me, I'm supposed to wear the crown. Sure, Bob was crowned king before her, but even when they do offer the damn thing to her, she still hates them, and then she just locks them in a dungeon. And as a whole, there's nothing I can actually say about her character outside of her Iron Man gown or what her personality is. With previous villains, there's like one, maybe two things I remember about them in terms of their character. Vector being the best example and El Macho being thick as fuck. But with how bland she is, it's somewhat self-explanatory why I gave her a different name as opposed to her actual name in the film. Now, up until this point, I've been consistently harsh at both this movie and the last one. So to put this in a positive light, I'll look for some nice things to say about it. Stewie Griffin makes a cameo, so that's gotta be something. The news reporter does call Bob a bald jaundiced child, and that was kind of funny. I can say the animation's fantastic, which it is, but sadly I can't count that as a positive, mainly for a reason I failed to mention with the last movie and their overall catalog. Something most of you are already aware of is that Illumination goes by a strategy where they make the movies look cost effective, by making them look as visually appealing to the masses as possible in spite of a relatively low budget. Explaining why they make so much money financially, like Jesus Christ. This is why the movie, while it looks good, looks a bit too good, in a sense where it feels kind of artificial. Everything is so clean and rich in detail that it doesn't really feel like it's set in the late 60s apart from a few exceptions, like clothing, some background extras, and that one part where they're watching TV and a bunch of random 60s shows pop up or whatever. And when ignoring how detailed and realistic the scenery looks, it becomes slightly more apparent that they were reusing assets. For example, this butler is literally ripped from the second movie. That, or maybe it's just confirming that he's somehow immortal enough to outlive the human race. The Minions movie is a prime example of how not to dedicate an entire story to comedic relief sidekicks. I may have not enjoyed Despicable Me 2, but at least it had some substance. Not good substance, but substance no less. With this one, there's no substance, no charm, no heart, it's boring, and Gru only shows up for less than 2 minutes, so what's the point? Gonna say this right off the bat, this movie fucking sucks. I'm not gonna go for that shit again. Can't say I'm surprised anymore since the franchise had already lost steam since the first sequel. And I do understand that these are kids films, but I can think of hundreds of better kids films than this that actually try. This one has the most uninspired story out of all of them, if you can call it that. Said story being about Gru and Lucy getting fired by the agency for letting the villain Randy Marsh get away, which naturally leads to it being about Gru discovering his long-lost twin brother. By the time they meet him for the first time, he starts to dislike him until he convinces Gru to continue his tradition of being the bad guy again. But Gru plans out a heist to steal the pink diamond in order to get his job back. Meanwhile, Lucy tries to be a competent mother to the girls, one of which ends up being with a lonely boy who becomes clingy to her, and the others try to find a unicorn, and then they find out it's a goat, and it leads to a really on-the-nose moral about family. Then Randy captures the girls for no reason other than to head for Hollywood in order to destroy it after he was cancelled for going through puberty. Oh, and the Minions leave Gru and get arrested. If you noticed how I've been describing the movie in a disjointed fashion, then congratulations, your prizes are 2 tickets to Minions: The Rise of Gru. Yeah, this might be one of the first films I've seen to have an identity crisis or some shit, because several side plots are introduced. Most of them aren't just pointless and contrived, but they also lead the film to have no real pacing. Things just kinda happen for the sake of all the characters to do something. A good chunk of these could have just been cut from the movie and they would make no difference. Like, Lucy has a character arc of being a mom, which on its own is already odd when you consider how long they were married compared to how many times they try capturing Randy Marsh, but the arc is so rushed and underutilized, it gets resolved literally just after 2 scenes, and the ending just shoehorns an emotional payoff where Agnes calls her a mom to remind the audience that the arc is complete, I guess. As for the other side plots, they're also underutilized to a point where I forgot they were even in the fucking movie, like the unicorn subplot and, surprisingly enough, the plot where the Minions get arrested. I say surprisingly because they rarely appear in the film outside of some filler and when they're sent to prison. You'd think I'd be happy that the Minions didn't get as much screen time as before, in which case you'd be right, but somehow they've made way for an even worse character than the Minions combined.
Brother! Drew!
Shut the fuck up, I will fucking laser you with alien fucking eyes.
This guy is meant to be one of the main protagonists, and he sounds just as delightful, as nails on a chalkboard.
Oh, I miss the minions.
Goddamn right.
He isn't even that important in the main story, he mostly just screws around all the time with Gru trying to be the voice of reason. He doesn't even learn anything by the end of the film, he just does the same shit he did before, not to mention barely showing any proper chemistry or build up between him and Gru. When the inevitable third act breakup comes in and then Gru rightfully goes like, "No wonder your dad thinks you're a screw up," I just internally chuckle at how they attempted an emotional scene with this guy and this guy. Going in, I expected Randy Marsh, because hell if I care what his name is, to be a saving grace to the film, but I suppose it's because of the fact that Trey Parker plays him and confirms at the premiere that he only did the role for his daughter.
Like, oh, how cool would it be though to be able to go to the premiere and have my daughter be able to watch something I actually did instead of like, can't see this, you know.
Well, now she's old enough to see it and appreciate
it's
it.
Great, she's here now, she's almost 4, you know, and it's really fun because she, you know, this is actually what I was looking forward to when I was doing
this. Is too wholesome. But yeah, this character kinda sucks. His shtick is that I used to be famous, but I went through puberty or something, I got canceled, and I'ma be the villain I played on my show.
I've been a bad boy.
Oh great, now I'm not gonna unhear his voice say that, fuck. I was gonna say that this backstory is complete shit, but then I realized it predicted the future. Despicable Me 3 is genuinely so bad I can't tell if it's worse than Minions or equally just as awful. Okay, you know what, actually scratch that. At least Minions had like one good joke. This one has no good jokes, no heart, barely a story, and yet it earned $1 billion at the box office. But at the end of the day, I get why. This franchise, while I don't care for it, is harmless and inoffensive. It does have an audience who are legit fans of it, mostly kids and even those roughly my age. Regardless if it's bad or not, they'll go watch it no matter what. And I can somewhat understand the appeal to them. Hell, I'll be honest, there was a time where I had some fondness for them. Of course, years later, I knew that these were cash grabs. But now having seen the whole franchise further, I realize my main issue is that, in spite of the flaws, it's not that it does anything inherently harmful, it's just that the movies don't really try at all. At least not enough to leave a lasting impact, except for the original, not only since it was their first film, but it was the only time to me where the simplicity actually worked. The sequels, while having a very simplistic tone and style, aren't done out of any passion. It feels artificially done to cut costs, and trying to appeal to everyone by not taking many risks to make them stand out with one another. They all just kind of blend in, mainly for the filler moments added that kill the pace of an already messy plot. Now, this might come off as a surprise, but despite how cynical I can be, I'm not exactly a professional film reviewer, but even I noticed how shallow and weak these films got by the next entry, and it's unlikely that the future installments will see any improvement anytime soon. Yet we're still not done.
Come on, motherfuckers, come on. Come on, motherfuckers, come on. Yeah. Come on, motherfuckers.
Sike, got ya.
Got him.
Just when you thought it was over, you knew this was coming. I won't go too in-depth with this one, since as of the making, it's still out in theaters. Minor spoilers will be brought up, but fuck it. It's a Minions sequel, not exactly a Christopher Nolan movie. Unfortunately, I'm still broke with no bitches, and paying for a ticket won't be an obligation, although I did manage to watch it for free. Where, you may ask? I don't know, I guess it was my lucky day or whatever. Anyways, was it worth it? It was certainly a movie. It was written, it was animated, it was voice acted. The part where young Gru says it's time for me to rise was quite the movie-going experience. And the Minions were also here. The Minions Rise of Gru is one of the movies ever made. But real talk, I had low expectations going in, but damn it, it was probably the most fun I had watching a Despicable Me movie in a long time, which is unheard of when you see how much I've criticized the previous films for being boring or relying too much on milking the tater tots as possible. Here, with how Gru works off of them, it sort of feels like a breath of fresh air rather than just relying on a story for them and only them. And when it does focus on the core Minions, they actually give them real character development, unlike the last movie. Obviously, the film does have a lot of filler and is kind of scattershot for a majority of its run, plus the main villainous 6 are really basic ass villains who don't have much of a character at all outside of just being bad, though they do have some pretty cool designs. Like, that looks pretty fucking cool, man. And I'll be honest, it could have been better if the movie focused a little more on Gru and his rise, since he more than anything becomes a plot device for the minions to rescue, and doesn't really feel like a main character in his own movie. I did like his relationship to his idol Knuckles though, and no, it's not who you think. They have a pretty good bond with one another, and Knuckles on his own is actually kinda interesting. I wish they would have focused more on them. Other than that, the first and third act surprisingly got engaging with the amount of nonsensical shit going on. There's some neat visuals, and there are some admittingly clever callbacks and references to the films, like the anti-villain agency whatever shows up, and Dr. Nefario has like 2 scenes of total screen time. Kid Vector shows up, so that immediately makes it a 10 out of 10. This film had no right being as fun as it got, but make no mistake, it's still not exactly a great film. It doesn't go anywhere above half decent, but thankfully it at least tries to stand out more from the rest by how well some of the nonsensical stuff work. And I can't believe I'm saying this, it's actually an improvement over the first. May not be worth trashing the theaters over, but was still more quick and to the point than the first film, without feeling dragged out. It's a perfectly fine 6 out of 10, which to be perfectly honest, is the nicest thing I had to say about the franchise since, well, the first movie. Like, holy shit. Congratulations, Minions. This new movie no longer makes me hate you nearly as much as I did before. Yay! Still not a fan, but in the words of the Lord himself, I'm pleasantly surprised. You're okay. You're nothing more than okay, but you are okay. I'm shocked you're not a total failure. But yeah, I still stand by what I said about the Despicable Me franchise overall. One good movie and one okay movie isn't gonna change my opinion that this series could use a well-deserved hiatus, at least for the next 2 years until they further run it down to the ground or whatever. Again, these are movies for children, but the original and even the new movie is aimed for that target audience too, and they still had some effort put into it, unlike the other 3, that ended up just getting worse and worse. It's a franchise that doesn't try, made by a company that also doesn't try. Making this video after watching an entire night's worth of mediocrity has taught me some valuable lessons, however. One is that I'll be taking a break from these films for a while. I'll probably watch the original if it was put on against my will, but otherwise I'm done with this series. 2, this now makes me feel a lot more pumped to get my lazy ass back to work on my larger project, on top of catching up with some side productions to fill in the gap. And 3, marathoning these at night was a terrible fucking idea to begin with, and I will never do that again. But what do you think of these movies? Do you like them? Was I too harsh or scattershot? Furthermore, who's your favorite Minion? What other franchise do you want me to make a marathon of in the future? Let me know in the comments below and watch the movies for yourselves to form an opinion. Thank you for watching, and bye. Okay, that'll be the only time you'll hear me speak Minionese, because quite frankly, I am fucking terrible.
Back in the middle, it's gone. She like I smell cologne. Yeah, I just had to deal, I'm on. Yeah, yeah. Go where I want, good. Play if you want, let's do it. I'm a young CEO, sure. Yeah. The first nigga play on my body, and then I just check my balance. I probably pull up to your hood and come by me.